Alright, well, haven't made a video recently. Need to do some walking. Let's do a walk and talk. We're going to talk about Jordan Peterson. I watched his Jubilee. Supposedly it was originally titled One Christian versus 20 Atheists, and then they changed the title to Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists. I mean, who knows what their exact motivation was, but aside from the fact that Jordan Peterson is sort of unwilling to really directly answer things in general, including, are you a Christian or not? So that would be, I guess, at least part of the obvious motivation for changing the title. But anyway, yeah, there's plenty of, if you read the comments of that video, and there's plenty of people that kind of see his bullshit. So in some ways it kind of, not that this channel with barely any viewership is needs to be the beacon of shining a light on whatever bullshit, but it does, for whatever reason, it sort of relieves me of feeling like, oh, I gotta call out whatever. Maybe that's why I don't make videos in part anyways, because yeah, I mean, any bullshit that people pull, someone's calling it out. But I guess that's sort of, this is a tangent as usual, but sort of can be a really demotivating thing in general for almost anything in life, right? Anything that everyone's doing something, right? Is someone out there making good movies, good music, good literature, whatever. It's like, and I know that's I know the obvious reasons why that's a sort of silly point of view, to sort of feel like you don't need to do something because someone else is doing it, but I don't know, maybe it's not completely silly either. Anyway, let's get on to the subject matter. Basically, maybe I'll try to connect it to something a little bit broader, as opposed to just a criticism of Jordan Peterson on how this is a sort of a bigger issue with people and our culture in general, what's happening with him. But and in the video itself, the 20 people debating him actually do a really good job of calling out his bullshit. Like, these are really smart people, and I was impressed by their ability to sort of, duel with him. And so to start with, I think a mistake that people make is this sort of conflation of good characteristics, like this conflation that they come together in like a bundle, right? Like intelligence, honesty, being of good moral character, and so on. It's like they think that you if you're lacking one, you're lacking all, or if you have one, you have all. And so that's the thing, is like I noticed some people being like, oh, Jordan Peterson, pseudo-intellectual. It's like, okay, I don't know what a pseudo-intellectual is, but I can say very confidently that Jordan Peterson, even if you want to argue who out there is smarter or not, I think you're a fool or a liar, one or the other, or possibly both, right? Not a guarantee. You might just be a fool. You might just be a liar. You might be both. If you don't recognize that he is more intelligent than, let's just comfortably say, 99% of people. Now, if you're smarter than 99 out of 100, does that qualify you according to, I don't know, whoever's standard or the dictionary definition, right? We're going to get into that here, definitions. But of what qualifies as an intellectual versus pseudo-intellectual, I mean, he's a very intelligent man. Now, does that mean he's of good moral character? It doesn't mean that he is or isn't. Does it mean he's honest? It doesn't mean that he is or isn't. These would be independent things that we have to assess, right? But I think the mistake that's made is, because Jordan Peterson, now kind of cutting to the chase, getting to the point, because he is disingenuous in a lot of ways, in a lot of his conversations, it's not necessary to label him as stupid or not intellectual. Even if, yes, you might say, oh, his intellect is overrated or whatever. It's kind of a fruitless, pointless thing. And then you sort of get bogged down in sort of pointless, like, just like a pointless debate on how intelligent is he really, when actually maybe a more interesting and relevant question is, how honest is he? How moral do we think he is, even within the framework of honesty? What role does honesty play in morality, which even in the debates that comes up in a variety of ways. So anyway, back to Jordan Peterson specifically and how he handles things. He is, someone summed it up perfectly when they said that he retreats into semantic fog, I think is what they said, something like that anyway, but I think that might have been it. Semantic fog. He retreats into semantic fog. Basically, everything just becomes, and this can happen just in general when you're debating people or things, it's like you spend endless time talking, what's the definition? What's the definition? And it's such a stupid conversation. Yes, in order to have a meaningful conversation, there has to be some degree of agreement on definitions, but everyone doesn't have to stick their foot, in the ground and say, well, no, my definition's one. Just for the sake of conversation, you can even accept really a ridiculous definition, right? You can accept that and say, okay, I'll accept your ridiculous definition, but for the sake of what we're trying to talk about here, I'm going to use a different word for something else, because I'm also really wanting to talk about something else that your definition, whether it's too narrow or too broad, is not really covering. And so I can concede, if you want to sort of be the arbitrator of what words mean, since I'm not going to let my ego or whatever it is get in the way of a dialogue where we're talking about something similar, I'm not going to just keep debating definitions. But Peterson, because the reality is he does like to play around with definitions and likes to sort of avoid just the reality of, okay, maybe in some framework you can say this word means this or this means that. We do know there does seem to be trends on how people interpret words, right? So it's like, even if you can come up with a decent argument on why God actually means anal juice, right? Even if you can come up with some scholarly reason on why God means anal juice, there's no actual point in sort of debate. Well, you're an atheist because depending on your views on anal juice, it's like we understand that that's not how it's commonly perceived, what people are commonly talking about. But, since he wants to play these games, it's kind of like, yeah, what does he care about? He cares about winning a debate. What does he care about? Showing off how he can win a debate. Actually, what I do think is a sign of intelligence, not necessarily a sign of honesty or good character, is that he can take a position that is, in my opinion, obviously, the incorrect one, and do a good job of holding his ground. I mean, it's debatable in this Jubilee thing. I don't necessarily I think he does a good job compared to, certainly what the average person would be able to withstand with these 20 people that seem, I'd say, in my opinion, pretty intelligent people. I find them impressive. Maybe someone else disagrees and we'll call them pseudo-intellectuals, I don't know, like I said, I don't know who the real intellectuals are, but they seem like intelligent people to me. I thought they made compelling points and generally articulated themselves in good ways, even though, yes, some of them Jordan Peterson called out for being a smartass and he didn't want to engage, which was valid because, yeah, it's not necessary. I mean, you can make your point without just kind of coming off so obnoxiously. And we could argue that he comes off obnoxiously too, whatever. But, okay, let's not get too off track here. So, what he does is he avoids actually talking about certain things. Like, he won't tell you, or he kind of implies, I think, that he's an agnostic when it comes to the afterlife, and he seems to be, I guess, an agnostic, or at least won't tell us what he thinks about how most people are talking about God as a sort of real, kind of being that is all-loving, all-powerful, that can intervene in our lives, that rewards and punishes in a variety of really tangible ways. not just these metaphorical, symbolic, that sort of, if you go around, if one of the commandments is not to kill and you go around killing people, you're going to suffer because, you'll be ostracized from society, and the friends and allies of whoever you killed will come after you. You'll be on the run. And, basically that you can find certain kind of rules in religious texts, and particularly within Judeo-Christian values, Old Testament, New Testament, all that stuff, that we can say, oh yeah, okay, here's how you can create your own hell on earth by, breaking certain rules, right? Now, if we're really, though, honest and we go over all the rules, we can come up with sort of good arguments on why certain rules are better than others, and that's being generous. And that's why people will bring up things like, oh, it's kind of funny that the Bible's giving you guidelines for how to be a good slave owner. Like, wouldn't it just kind of cut to the chase and say, stop the whole slave owning thing? And that's why it does take a certain intellectual prowess to dance around in the way he does. Now, do I think that it's not also obvious that he's doing that? Well, no, it is obvious. But if we agree, which maybe we don't, but let's just assume that if I'm talking to someone that might generally have a similar perspective that I do, assuming you kind of agree generally with my viewpoint on religion and God and that whole ordeal, that we can agree that it's much more difficult, just from an intellectual standpoint, to try to come up with good arguments for an inherently weaker, incorrect position. So there is something impressive if you can hold your own, just from the perspective of being a good debater or intellectual, to even compete at all when you have such a weak position, right? It's like if you told me, like, I had to take the position why, killing people arbitrarily is moral. If I somehow could, at least seemingly in some way, hold my ground on such an untenable, incorrect position, there would be something impressive just from the sake of, if you're looking for like entertainment and sort of intellectual, right? Intellectual entertainment, impressiveness, and an ability to argue. So anyway, that's enough of that point. But yeah, I mean, it's so obvious what he does. What I believe is, there's a couple angles we could take here, and it can always be a combination of things on what motivates Jordan Peterson. I mean, the first angle is the accusation that, he's a grifter, man. He's a grifter. Now, could that be somewhat true? I do think that in the modern media, whether we call it social media, whatever, it's like one and the same now, kind of. In the modern media age, people can very easily discover what gets attention, what gets money. When does my bank account increase? When do my views increase? When do they decrease? When do I build up more fans and following? And so there is this automatic, almost unavoidable incentive that people have. And I'm not saying that Jordan Peterson is more or less susceptible to this. I don't know exactly that I'm willing to make a claim. I'll pull a Jordan Peterson and avoid, giving a strong opinion on this. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know to what degree he's more or less influenced by this than anybody else. But it would seem sort of natural, we'll say. It would seem like common sense that people are certainly influenced by what gets them money, power, approval, all those things that people generally seem to be attracted to, right? And so what am I getting at with this with Jordan Peterson is, yeah, I think he used to be a sort of, we'll just say, moderate guy when it comes to politics. I don't think he was overtly like right-wing. And, he got famous for some of the sort of anti-woke things and the not saying the pronouns or whatever, which I don't want to get too deep into that here, but whatever it is, obviously what made him go from being we'll just say relatively unknown, probably interesting professor and, authored a couple books or whatever, to mega celebrity was this sort of anti-woke sentiments that, it makes sense at the time, I think, why that helped him rise to popularity, because the reality is this woke stuff was on the rise. It had gone more and more to kooky land, and there wasn't really much obvious intellectual criticism of it. Sure, there were always, religious buffoons who would argue against everything by quoting the Bible, but there weren't people that really seemed to come from an actual common sense intellectual place to be able to sort of call out some of the woke nonsense. And so I think there was a genuine, from my perspective, someone who I think I am actually generally really a leftist and liberally minded in this sort of traditional sense of these words. But I like to think that I do have enough common sense to see when things go too far and when the wokeness is just absurd and goes into sort of a backward place, almost where, the woke people do everything that originally would turn me off from conservatives to begin with. Sort of this sort of tribal, kind of hateful, looking for an enemy to blame all our problems on, being irrational, kind of dogmatic, not critical thinkers, and just kind of holding to some sort of like tenets of what's good and bad, and certain things being unworthy or unsuited for actually breaking down and analyzing. And, you're automatically a immoral person if you question a certain commandment, so to speak. So really, the problem that I would ever have, that would have to begin with dogmatic religious people, with sort of what I would consider certain obnoxious conservative, stereotypes, if you will, would be the same exact sort of energy, the same exact mindset, which would have led me to feel discomforted by certain woke sentiments. The obvious one that I always mention is just why men shouldn't compete against women in sports, but it goes beyond that. That's just like such a easy layup of a position that it's just an easy example to give, I think, without having to get into the weeds, because to me, anyway, I think it's so obvious. Okay? So, anyway, let's get back on track. So, the issue is that, this really got him a lot of attention. Maybe he knew it would. I don't really know. I'm not sort of like an expert on the history of Jordan Peterson or every little quote he said or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination. But we can understand that if something seems to work, get you attention, get you money, you lean into it. And then, through that, he was embraced by the conservative community, eventually got picked up by, I guess he's part of Daily Wire, whatever it is. There's just more and more incentive to sort of lean into sort of the right wing, and then ultimately even more and more religious mindset. It's not to say that he didn't always have some sympathy for probably certain elements of religiosity, conservatism, whatever. Maybe he always had some, but clearly that increased, and it's hard to not believe that increased based on simply what was making him popular, right? We see YouTubers of all kind of persuasions that seem to lean into whatever works, right? They change their thing. They used to be this way politically, now they're this way. They used to be religious, now they're atheists. Whatever it is, whatever seems to get them approval and popularity, it's going to sort of push them more and more in that direction. There's very few people who seem to be, not that it's ever possible, and who's the one to sort of decide who's the pure critical thinkers. But you can see, I think, why people are kind of incentivized to move into some sort of box to figure out what lane works for them. And yeah, is he a grifter? Everybody's a grifter now, kind of, in some sense, right? Once they adopt a certain persona on this is who I am, they're probably not going to change it up. And they might experiment with changing it up, but if it affects their viewership, or even if who they are naturally, that once was popular and they see their viewership naturally declining, there often will be a shift, right? Oh, where's the culture headed now? Okay, moderate conservatism isn't cool anymore. I gotta have a little dabble of racism in there or hint at it. Okay, and that is what's happening a lot of, with some of these Daily Wire people. It's just like they have the worst takes on some of these things. Like, even if obviously I think the position should be, if someone says something like racist, it doesn't mean that they should have their entire lives forever destroyed. That's not that wild of a position to believe that. They go beyond this in some of these things, like where it's just obvious that they're racist. I mean, or that they're like apologetic for, or they word things in sort of like, I almost would say clever, but it's not really clever. It's sort of, it's like Jordan Peterson's word games, but actually far less subtle, far less intelligent, just kind of clearly, having more sympathy for, racist, hateful kind of people and comments than they do other things. So anyway, that's enough of the sort of like, is he a grifter or not, or whatever. Like, it's not a yes or no. It's just a sort of, you can see why people are incentivized to lean into some sort of ideological thinking and can't really remain sort of neutral, critical thinkers who can address each issue in some sort of like honest way. So, but the other thing would be, let's just assume that he's not, let's just even go with the idea that he wasn't this at all, that he is totally authentic and, he at least would present himself on someone who's willing to die on the hill of truth, right? He would sacrifice his life for the sake of honesty and authenticity. Okay, so let's give him some credit for a minute and say maybe that's true. So with that possibility, it seems clear that he's come to the conclusion that the belief in God, and perhaps particularly the Christian God, is what is practical in terms of what is best for society and as well as the individual. And that he, regardless of whether it's true or not, right? True in the sense of, are these stories in the Bible things that actually literally took place, or are they just metaphors and, sort of symbolic of, hell as a sort of place of, emotional and physical discomfort, or hell as an actual other kind of place that it seems, anyway, that most Christians seem to believe in, a place of some sort of real, legitimate, eternal torment, not just the fact that if you do bad things, karma comes to get you, sort of thing. Seems a little bit more literal than that for, I would say, most Christians. But anyway, so he might believe that generally, without religion, particularly Christianity, that nihilism is sort of inevitable, and that generally through nihilism it leads to personal unhappiness, which then would kind of obviously bleed out into the society, and an unhealthy, unhappy society. Now, I don't know how much I want to spend in this video talking about whether that's true or not, that nihilism leads to that more or less than Christianity. Maybe I'll get into it. We'll see. But the issue here, though, then becomes, if he truly believes this, what he kind of figures is, well, he sees that for a lot of people to sort of maintain this religiosity, this sort of defense against the dangers of nihilism, most people can't really fully take religion seriously if they just see it as Aesop's fables, if it's just brilliant literature, if it's just really good symbolic stories and lessons for life, that people can't, they might take some sort of learning lesson from it, but it can't have that deeper feeling. It can't ultimately, that people would still probably fall back into this sort of dangerous nihilism if they see it as just, even granting it something, some people would say that the Bible's not even good literature, right? But not going to get into that debate here. But even granting it the highest sort of respect while also, treating it as if it's just stories, not something that actually happened. So even if you looked at it like a great piece of literature, it's not going to really, he probably understands on some level. I mean, obviously I would think he'd understand that it's not a defense against nihilism because, well, there is no heaven actually. There is no hell. It really is another way of saying that karma is a thing. That killing and lying and stealing and just all of these things generally lead to negative consequences. And these are things that anyone with half a brain already knows, right? It doesn't matter if you're religious or not. You can kind of figure out through common sense on why doing bad things can turn out bad. And it's not necessarily some mystical karma thing or some man in the sky or anything even close to that. It can just be that sort of obvious 1 + 1 = 2, right? If I punch you in the face, you might punch me back, right? And then even beyond that, even if it's from a perspective of, oh, well, we don't want to look at morality as this purely selfish endeavor, yes, we can inject the empathy thing that regardless of debating on how did we evolve and how did empathy come about and what does that mean or whatever, we know that there seems to be this thing where most of us, or maybe that's changing, I don't know, a lot of us seem to have this thing where it's not just about an obvious negative consequence like being punched in the face back. It's that we oftentimes, maybe hopefully we would do this more or have more of this, but we care that when we punch someone, especially if it's someone that we think maybe didn't deserve it, has redeeming qualities, we can relate to them, all these different things, we feel guilt, we feel bad, we don't want them to suffer, right? Some of the time, depending on the person, depending on the context, depending on how much empathy you have in general or for an individual person and why you think that it's warranted to have empathy for them or to compassion or whatever word you want to use. But so either way though, the more you analyze it from an honest perspective, and I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm more intelligent than Jordan Peterson. He obviously has a pretty masterful use of the English language and lots of knowledge, and I don't know how much he's studied the Bible or not, more than I have though, but that doesn't make him more intellectually honest than I am. And that's kind of back to the beginning of this video. It's that even if on some levels of intelligence it'd be obvious that he has more knowledge about X, Y, and Z, he has a much greater vocabulary than I do, he spent a lot more time debating, so he would be better at debating, right? But if we were able to sort of get around the fact that he knows more words than I do and more words than a lot of people he debates, and that he can pull out sort of facts that people might not know that make him look like he is coming from a higher place of knowledge, authority, and then ultimately truth, that's where the bullshit is happening. Because my argument would be, for me personally and plenty of other people, it doesn't matter if they're more intelligent in some sort of categories, are they more intellectually honest, right? And that's where I'm saying it's a different category. There's a difference between intelligence. I mean, I know this is obvious, but I think we often forget this. Seems to be the case. There's a difference between intelligence, honesty, good moral character, and so on. And so, yes, I am arguing that he lacks in intellectual honesty. He's playing word games. If you just say, stop playing the word games, can you answer this question? He'll just keep falling back to, well, define this. Well, I define it differently. It's like, okay, bro, you know how most Christians seem to see God, right? Well, what do you mean by most? Do you have any research? Do you know that this one Christian over here actually defines Christianity the way I do, as the symbolic blah, blah, blah of consciousness? And so it's just a game. It's just a game that at least seems like most people with a fair amount of intelligence see through. But the problem with this in society in general is I do think that the common person, just the average run-of-the-mill person, they don't see through not just with him, just in general, they don't see through intellectual dishonesty, manipulation, word games. They don't see through the grift and the motivations of different people, right? And so, I don't know, are stupid people dangerous? Well, yeah, stupid people in a mob, right, with pitchforks are dangerous, right? They can be violent, they can carry out violence to a much greater degree in higher numbers. But there's also a particular kind of danger in people that are highly intelligent, or even just above average in intelligence, but with bad intentions and with intellectual dishonesty, with what I would consider, and perhaps others, low moral character, right? Now, does Jordan Peterson have low moral character or not? I don't know. But like I said, if we're putting aside the sort of grifter angle, if he really genuinely has determined that he thinks that the world is a better place with people believing in God, however he loosely defines it, it might be that he's determined, even though he professes so much honesty, that the importance of honesty, that this is like the hill he's going to die on, he won't fully admit, or maybe there's some clip where he does, probably, but he generally, at least, won't fully admit that if he has come to the conclusion that the only real defense for nihilism, which he sees as a destructive force, is religion, and particularly Christianity, that he's going to think that some degree of word games, or as I would call it more directly, lying, dishonesty, disingenuous, whatever word, maybe you want to use a softer word for lying, because, liar, right? I might think it's kind of accurate. Okay, we can be nicer and say disingenuous, intellectually dishonest instead of liar, right? But he might think, well, that actually is worth it. And that's the sort of the irony of the fact that in this video, he was so unwilling to say, oh, if you were in Nazi Germany and you had some Jews hiding in the attic, would you lie to the Nazis? He couldn't answer such an easy question to answer. Now, even if you say it's not easy because maybe you'd be afraid and you'd think that's not the angle he's taking it in. He's not saying, well, I gotta be morally humble and that I might be selfish. No, he's not saying that. He's acting like there's just this principle of truth and that he wouldn't lie because lying is bad, and he can't admit this sort of subjective, complicated nature of morality, because if he gives ground to the fact that, well, actually sometimes lying makes perfect sense, you definitely should not lie to Nazis. And if you even have a hesitation of that, it's a little bit creepy, a little bit makes you seem, are you immoral or just intellectually backed into a corner where you have to hold a sort of untenable position or avoid answering a question because you know that your argument will break down as we get into the complicated subjective nature of reality, morality, etc. And it's not a black and white thing, right? That context matters and there's a time and place for everything, and sometimes moral dilemmas are confusing, but that one isn't one, actually. Funnily enough, this isn't a very difficult thing I think, at least from a moral hypothetical standpoint, where you're at least presenting yourself as a good person who is hiding Jews in the attic to begin with, right? That in itself is you're engaging in an activity which would be lying. Now, he says, it wouldn't even get to that point. I don't know what he even means by that. Like, what, Jordan Peterson would have stopped Hitler in his tracks before he even got that far to need to hide the Jews? It's so obviously bullshit when you can't answer such a simple hypothetical question, and then you act like hypotheticals are just always useless and absurd, or, he's got to go into sort of his word bank of confusion to get you off his scent of a position that's untenable, that is going to contradict itself, that's going to show itself to be flawed. Instead of admitting the flaws in the position, he can't. But on some level, maybe he knows this deep down, And maybe if we're even giving him the most benefit of the doubt possible, that this isn't all about some grift, like I was saying, if he really believes that there's only one way to combat nihilism, and that nihilism is like the ultimate danger, maybe he thinks he has to engage in lying, actually. Now, he might not admit, in some sense, that he would lie to Nazis, because he can't admit the truth about lying in general, that he actually very much believes in lying for a greater good. And that's where it becomes so right, ironic, because he probably does think that some level of bullshittery, or maybe a huge level of bullshittery, is needed to maintain the goodness of your personal, emotional well-being and society's well-being. He thinks this lie of religion is needed, right? And even though he might think it's not a lie, by the way he defines it, he understands that other people see it differently, and that just the adoption of Christianity from a symbolic perspective takes the entire wind out of the sails. And, so this is why he has to avoid confronting it, because he knows that saying it's literally true is an untenable position that he can't defend very well, but that the symbolic version is a much easier thing to argue for, as long as you can keep avoiding directly answering questions, right? So he might think, like I said, that this is that he is lying for the greater good, and funnily enough, within that, he can't admit to lying for a greater good in the most obvious of circumstances, because maybe that leads to you smelling this whole thing out and just calling it for what it is, which is that, you don't really believe in any of this stuff. It's all just word games all the way down.